When a newly hired maid began working at one of the city's most prestigious mansions, she couldn't help but notice the uneasy tension between the well-respected millionaire and his wife. Day after day, she observed how the wife remained within the walls of their grand home, never once stepping beyond the property's gates. It wasn't until one day, by pure chance, that she discovered the dark truth behind why the woman always wore dresses that covered her neck. In that moment, the maid knew she had to act fast. Before we start, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like these stories, don't forget to subscribe. Elena Clark stood in the kitchen of Richard Davenport's opulent villa, her heart racing with anticipation. At 35, she was the newest addition to the staff, having only been employed for a few weeks. Today was unlike any other day she had experienced so far. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as the staff prepared for Mr. Davenport's distinguished guests. The villa, usually a quiet weekend retreat for the millionaire, was now a hive of activity. Mr. Davenport and his wife, Sophia Lauren Davenport, had arrived the previous evening to host a crucial business meeting. Elena had heard from Marco Russo, the head chef, that today's meeting was of the highest importance. She and the other staff members had been working tirelessly since yesterday to ensure everything was perfect. As Elena polished the silverware, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had always admired Richard Davenport from afar, seeing him as a source of inspiration through his media presence and achievements. The opportunity to work in his home, even if she rarely saw him, felt like a dream come true. Jonathan, the head butler, entered the kitchen, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Everything must be flawless," he reminded them, his eyes scanning the room critically. "Mr. Davenport expects nothing less than perfection." Elena nodded, determined to prove her worth. She turned to her sister Hannah, who was also employed as a maid in the villa longer than her. "Have you ever served Mr. Davenport personally?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Hannah nodded her head, and Jonathan overheard and interjected. "Everyone here has had the opportunity to serve Mr. Davenport directly," he explained. "He believes in staff rotation to ensure everyone is capable of meeting his standards." Elena's eyes widened with interest. "I've heard such wonderful things about him," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I hope I get the chance to serve him personally one day. It would be such an honor." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Davenport is indeed a good man," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "He has high standards and expects excellence, but he's also fair and generous when a job is well done." Elena nodded, absorbing every word. She was about to return to her task when Jonathan surprised her. "Elena, if you'd like, you can handle the breakfast service today." She froze, hardly believing her ears. "Really? Are you sure?" Jonathan nodded confidently. "You're ready. Just remember everything you've learned these past 2 weeks." Marco, who had been listening to the conversation, chimed in. "Breakfast for Mr. and Mrs. Davenport is ready. Remember, Elena, knock twice before entering their room. Don't wait for them to open the door. Mr. Davenport doesn't like to be kept waiting. Place the tray on the table and leave quietly. Only speak if spoken to." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she took the breakfast tray from Marco. Hannah gave her an encouraging smile and a thumbs up as she left the kitchen. The weight of the responsibility settled on her shoulders as she made her way up the grand staircase to the master bedroom. Standing outside the door, Elena took a deep breath to calm her nerves. She knocked twice as instructed and entered the room quietly. As she closed the door behind her, she was startled to see Mr. Davenport standing in the doorway of the bathroom, fully dressed. The sound of raised voices came from the bathroom where the shower was running. Elena caught snippets of their argument. "Get yourself together for once," Mr. Davenport hissed. "These are important guests, and I can't afford for you to embarrass me in front of them." Elena's cheeks burned with embarrassment at having witnessed such a private moment. She quickly placed the breakfast tray on the table and turned to leave, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But Mr. Davenport's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Wait," he commanded, his tone stern but controlled. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face him, fearing she had done something wrong. Mr. Davenport shouted towards the bathroom, "Stay here, be quiet." Before approaching Elena, he seemed to be making an effort to soften his tone as he addressed her. "Is everything prepared downstairs for our guests?" Elena nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. The lounge has been prepared as per your request, and the kitchen is working on the main course for brunch. The canapes and desserts are ready. We've been busy since early this morning to ensure everything is perfect." Mr. Davenport studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well. I'll come with you to check everything myself." As they left the room, Elena couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. She was about to give a personal tour to Richard Davenport himself, the man she had admired for so long. Yet the tension from the argument she had witnessed lingered in the air, reminding her that even the lives of the wealthy and successful were not without their complications. Elena's heart raced as she led Mr. Davenport through the villa, acutely aware of his presence behind her. The man she had admired from afar was now scrutinizing her work, and she was determined not to disappoint. They started in the living room, where Elena had meticulously arranged fresh flowers and ensured every surface gleamed. Mr. Davenport nodded approvingly, running a finger along a polished side table. Next, they moved to the lounge where the meeting would take place. Elena held her breath as Mr. Davenport inspected the room, his eyes scanning every detail from the perfectly aligned chairs to the strategically placed notepads and pens. "Excellent," he murmured, and Elena felt a surge of pride. Their final stop was the kitchen, where Marco Russo was putting the finishing touches on the brunch menu. The air was filled with tantalizing aromas as Marco explained each dish to Mr. Davenport. "This is a twist on the classic Eggs Benedict," Marco said, gesturing to a beautifully plated dish. "I've used prosciutto instead of Canadian bacon and added a touch of truffle to the hollandaise." Mr. Davenport sampled a few bites, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. "Impressive, Marco. Your creativity never fails to surprise me. Remember, only start plating after the guests arrive. We want everything to be fresh and at the perfect temperature." As they exited the kitchen, Mr. Davenport turned to Elena. "Thank you. Everything seems to be in order." He paused, studying her face. "You're new here, aren't you? I don't recall seeing you before." Elena nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, sir. This is my 3rd week. I started 2 weeks ago." Mr. Davenport's eyes traveled from her face to her impeccably pressed uniform. "You've presented yourself very well. Keep up the good work and you'll surely be rewarded." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to work here." Just then, Mrs. Davenport appeared, looking stunning in an elegant silk dress. Elena couldn't help but marvel at her beauty, feeling a twinge of envy at the seemingly perfect life she led. Mr. Davenport's demeanor changed instantly. His eyes lit up as he saw his wife, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "You look beautiful, darling," he said, kissing her cheek. "You'll make quite an impression on our guests." But as Elena watched, she noticed something off about Mrs. Davenport's reaction. There was a slight flinch when her husband touched her, a tension in her shoulders that didn't match the affectionate gesture. Elena dismissed it, assuming it was residual awkwardness from their earlier argument. "If there's nothing else, I'll return to my duties," Elena said, preparing to excuse herself. Mr. Davenport nodded, his attention still on his wife. He kissed her cheek again, inhaling her perfume. "You smell divine," he murmured. Mrs. Davenport remained silent, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Elena thought it was sweet, in a way, that even wealthy couples could have their moments of tension. She was sure things would smooth over as the day progressed. As Elena walked away, she glanced at her watch. It was 10 a.m. The guests would be arriving any moment. She overheard Mrs. Davenport speaking to her husband. "I'll wait in the foyer and welcome the guests myself," she said, slipping free from Mr. Davenport's arm as she moved toward the grand front door. Mr. Davenport's reaction was immediate and startling. "Sophia," he called out, his voice deep, firm, and serious. The sound froze Elena in her tracks, and she couldn't help but turn to look. Mr. Davenport fixed his wife with a stern gaze. "You know the rules. Don't try to leave the house," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an unmistakable command. Mrs. Davenport nodded silently and made her way back to the couch in the living room. Noticing Elena still standing there, Mr. Davenport's attention snapped to her. "It's not right to linger and watch," he said, his tone sharp. "Go to the foyer and wait to welcome the guests instead." Embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping, Elena bowed deeply. "I'm sorry, sir. Of course." She hurried away, her mind whirling with questions about what she had just witnessed. As Elena made her way to the grand foyer, her mind raced with thoughts about the interaction she had just seen. Mr. Davenport's words echoed in her head. "You know the rules. Don't leave the house." It seemed strange, almost controlling. She tried to rationalize it, wondering if perhaps Mrs. Davenport was ill or if there was some other reason for such a strict rule. Elena positioned herself by the door, standing straight and composed. She watched as Hannah and the other maids arranged a table with an assortment of canapes and welcome drinks. The anticipation in the air was palpable as they awaited the arrival of the important guests. Soon, the sound of luxury cars pulling into the winding driveway broke the silence. 3 sleek vehicles came to a stop in front of the villa. Elena took a deep breath, reminding herself of the proper protocol for greeting guests. As the car doors opened, Elena stepped forward with a bright, professional smile. "Welcome to the Davenport Villa," she said warmly, gesturing for the guests to enter. Mr. and Mrs. Davenport appeared in the foyer, their earlier tension masked by polished smiles. They greeted their guests with enthusiasm, exchanging pleasantries and compliments. "Richard, my old friend," one of the guests exclaimed, clapping Mr. Davenport on the back. "This place is even more magnificent than—" "Excuse me," Mrs. Davenport said softly. "Could you bring coffee for the table? And make mine a double shot, please?" Elena nodded, noting the request. It seemed odd given the fresh, cold drinks already on the table. Nevertheless, she hurried to the kitchen to relay the order to Marco. Returning with a tray of hot coffee cups, Elena served Mrs. Davenport last, making sure her cup contained the requested double shot. As she placed the darker liquid before her, she caught a flicker of gratitude in Mrs. Davenport's eyes. With the brunch underway, Elena and Hannah took their positions outside the lounge door. The sound of laughter and relaxed conversation drifted out, along with praises for the food. Elena leaned closer to Hannah, whispering, "Did you notice how Mrs. Davenport isn't allowed to leave the house? It's strange, isn't it?" Hannah nodded. "It's always been that way. I think it's just their marriage arrangement. You know, rich people have their own uniqueness, unlike us." Elena, relieved she wasn't the only one who found it odd, lowered her voice. "Does anyone know why?" Hannah shrugged. "Not really. It's been that way since she arrived. Mr. Davenport is very protective of her. When she does go out, there's always a group of bodyguards surrounding her in a tight circle. But even the First Lady doesn't stay indoors all the time," Elena mused. "True," Hannah conceded, "but she's still lucky in many ways. Mr. Davenport gives her everything she could want. Designer clothes, jewelry, trips to their other properties. She wants for nothing." Hannah's words, "wants for nothing," echoed in Elena's mind. She wasn't sure if she would truly want for nothing in Mrs. Davenport's position. Perhaps because she was used to the freedom of going wherever she pleased. As they continued their hushed conversation, a commotion from the lounge caught their attention. The scrape of chairs and raised voices filled the air. "Hannah! What's going on in there? Should we check?" Elena asked. "I don't know, but no, we shouldn't barge in unless called," Hannah replied. Before either of them could think what to do, a voice rang out. "Maid, we need assistance." Elena exchanged a worried glance with Hannah before quickly opening the door and stepping inside. The scene before her was one of confusion. Mrs. Davenport was standing, her face pale and drawn. "I'm not feeling well," Mrs. Davenport said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could you please escort me to my room?" Mr. Davenport's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure in front of the guests. "Of course, darling. Get some rest. We'll speak later." His eyes, however, told a different story as they followed his wife's retreating form. Elena guided Mrs. Davenport out of the lounge, acutely aware of the tension lingering behind them. As she closed the door and followed, she couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Davenport's angry glare. She wondered if the other guests had noticed it too, but as she trailed behind Mrs. Davenport to the stairs, a nagging feeling crept in. Something was off about the lady of the house. As Elena and Mrs. Davenport ascended the grand staircase, the tension from the dining room seemed to follow them like a heavy cloud. Mrs. Davenport's steps were unsteady, and Elena found herself instinctively reaching out to support her elbow. "You don't need to follow me upstairs," Mrs. Davenport said softly, her voice neutral but tinged with something Elena couldn't quite place. "I can manage on my own." Elena hesitated, torn between her professional duty and her growing concern for the woman beside her. "It's my job to look after everyone in the household, ma'am," she replied gently, "including you. I want to make sure you're all right." As they reached the top of the stairs, Mrs. Davenport paused, her hand gripping the banister tightly. For a moment, Elena thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability in the woman's eyes, but it was quickly masked. They continued down the hallway to the master bedroom. Mrs. Davenport's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob. "Thank you, Elena. You can leave now. I just need to rest." Elena bowed respectfully, but didn't move. "If you'd like, I can wait outside your door in case you need anything. The other staff are busy downstairs, and no one would hear you if you called for assistance." Mrs. Davenport shook her head. "No, that won't be necessary. I just want some time alone, remembered. You're too kind, Charles, Mr. Davenport replied smoothly. Sophia and I are delighted to have you all here. As the group moved towards the lounge, Alina couldn't help but notice Mrs. Davenport's stiff posture. She seemed uncomfortable, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Occasionally, Mr. Davenport would lean in to whisper something in her ear, causing her to nod slightly. Once the guests were settled at the dining table in the lounge, Alina, Jonathan, and Hannah began serving the dishes. As Alina placed a plate in front of Mrs. Davenport, the woman raised her hand slightly, but as she spoke, Elena noticed tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. The sight of those unshed tears stirred something in Elena. She knew it wasn't her place, knew she was overstepping boundaries, but she couldn't bear to leave Mrs. Davenport alone in this state. "Ma'am," Elena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you truly okay?" The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with implication. Then, like a dam breaking, Mrs. Davenport's composure crumbled. She shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Without thinking, Alina stepped forward and closed the bedroom door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. Mrs. Davenport sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Alina sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to intrude. "I'm here if you need to talk," she said gently. "And I promise I can be discreet." Mrs. Davenport looked up, her eyes red and puffy. Could I hug you?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. "I just need a shoulder." Surprised but moved, Elena nodded. Mrs. Davenport leaned into her, wrapping her arms around Elena's waist and burying her face in her shoulder. Her sobs grew louder, years of pent-up emotion pouring out as she held the crying woman. Elena's mind raced. What could have happened between Mrs. Davenport and her husband to cause such distress? Was this related to their morning argument, or was there something else, something deeper? After several minutes, Mrs. Davenport's sobs quieted. She pulled away, sniffled, and wiped her eyes. "Oh dear," she murmured, attempting a watery smile. "I've ruined my dress, and your uniform," she added, glancing at Elena. No, don't worry about my uniform, ma'am. It's okay," Elena said gently. Then she glanced down at the tear-stained fabric of the lady's dress, noticing smudges of her foundation. "Would you like me to get you a fresh one, ma'am?" Mrs. Davenport nodded. "Yes, please. The white one with the neckband, similar to this? It's in the walk-in wardrobe." Elena stood and made her way to the expansive wardrobe. As she sifted through the rows of designer dresses, she couldn't help but notice a pattern. Every single dress featured some form of high neckline or collar. It seemed an odd fashion choice for someone living in such a warm climate. Finding the requested dress, Elena returned to Mrs. Davenport. As she handed over the garment, their eyes met, and Elena saw a flicker of something, fear, gratitude, pass across Mrs. Davenport's face. "Thank you," Mrs. Davenport said, taking the dress. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment? I'd like you to take this dress to be cleaned right away. The tear stains and makeup marks need to be treated before they set." Elena nodded, watching as Mrs. Davenport disappeared into the ensuite bathroom. As she waited, her eyes scanned the room, taking in the opulent furnishings that suddenly seemed cold and impersonal. When Mrs. Davenport emerged, freshly changed, she handed the stained dress to Elena. Their fingers brushed, and Mrs. Davenport grasped Elena's hand for a moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For being here. For letting me cry. I'm sorry you had to see me like that." Elena squeezed her hand gently. "There's no need to apologize, ma'am. Everyone has moments of weakness. I understand." As Mrs. Davenport pulled her into another hug, Elena felt a surge of protectiveness wash over her. But as they embraced, the neckband of Mrs. Davenport's dress shifted slightly, revealing something that made Elena's blood run cold. There, on the pale skin of Mrs. Davenport's neck, was a tattoo. But not just any tattoo. It was a barcode. Elena's mind reeled as she stared at the barcode tattoo on Mrs. Davenport's neck. She pulled away from the hug abruptly, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Davenport asked, her voice tinged with concern. Elena struggled to find her voice, her professional demeanor momentarily shattered. "No, everything's all right, ma'am," she managed to say, trying to regain her composure. But the image of the barcode burned in her mind, and she couldn't let it go. "May I ask you something personal?" Mrs. Davenport tensed visibly but nodded slowly. "That tattoo on your neck, Elena began hesitantly. "What is it, and why are you hiding it? I noticed all your dresses cover your neck." The color drained from Mrs. Davenport's face. She took a step back, pulling away from Elena, her hand instinctively reaching for her neck. I think you need to leave, now, Elena," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she cleared her throat. "Forget what you saw. It's safer for everyone that way." But Elena couldn't let it go. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Mrs. Davenport's constant confinement to the house, her fearful demeanor, the controlling behavior of Mr. Davenport. "Safer?" Elena echoed. "I'm sorry, but ma'am, if you're in danger, you need to tell me. I've noticed how scared and unhappy you've been today. I want to help." Mrs. Davenport's eyes darted nervously to the door, as if expecting Mr. Davenport to burst in at any moment. "There's no but," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't know anything about my husband, and you don't want to find out who he truly is. It's better to keep it that way." Elena felt a chill run down her spine at these words. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "Who is he really?" Mrs. Davenport shook her head vehemently. "Please," she said, glancing at the name tag on Elena's uniform. "Elena, promise me you won't tell anyone about the tattoo. If anyone finds out, not only will I be in danger, but you and everyone else who knows will be in very big trouble." Elena's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. "I promise," she said solemnly, "but please let me help you if you need anything. You don't have to face this alone." Before Mrs. Davenport could respond, the bedroom door swung open. Mr. Davenport stood in the doorway, his expression dark. "The guests left early," he said, his voice cold. He turned to Elena. "You can leave now, go work in the garden or something." Elena hesitated, looking at Mrs. Davenport. The fear in the woman's eyes was palpable. "Now," Mr. Davenport repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elena had no choice but to leave. As she walked out, she exchanged one last meaningful glance with Mrs. Davenport, silently promising that this wasn't over. As Elena made her way down the hallway, she paused, her instincts telling her to stay close in case Mrs. Davenport needed help. She lingered near the door, straining to hear any sign of distress. Suddenly, Mr. Davenport's face appeared in the doorway. "I told you to go," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Don't linger here. We don't need anything else. The guests have left, and the lounge needs to be cleaned up. Go." Elena nodded, her heart pounding as she made her way downstairs. She glanced over her shoulder one last time before descending the stairs, only to see Mr. Davenport still watching her from the doorway. The intensity of his gaze made her skin crawl. As she reached the ground floor, Elena's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. She made her way to the kitchen, where the other staff members were busy cleaning up. Hannah approached her, concern etched on her face. "Elena, what's going on? You look pale," Hannah said, touching her sister's arm. Elena hesitated, remembering her promise to Mrs. Davenport. "Hannah," she said quietly, "have you ever noticed anything off about Mr. Davenport?" Hannah furrowed her brow. "Off? No, not really. He's always been very kind and polite, especially compared to some of the other wealthy people I've worked for." Marco, the chef, overheard their conversation as he passed by. "Mr. Davenport, he's a saint if you ask me. Very patient man, especially considering his wife's delicate nature." Elena felt a surge of anger at Marco's words. "Delicate? What do you mean?" Marco shrugged. "Well, I've been their private chef for 7 years now. I've seen Mrs. Davenport cry over the smallest things more times than I can count. She's lucky to be his wife, if you ask me. If she worked in the kitchen or anywhere else with that attitude, she'd be useless." Elena bit her tongue, fighting the urge to defend Mrs. Davenport. She remembered her promise and knew she couldn't reveal what she had learned. "Why are you asking about Mr. Davenport?" Marco inquired, eyeing Elena suspiciously. Elena shook her head, trying to appear nonchalant. "No reason, just curious. He's been my inspiration for such a long time." Marco nodded, seemingly satisfied, but then he added, "Must be because of the incident earlier. First time you've seen Mrs. Davenport cry, right? Well, trust me, it happens all the time. She's just a sensitive soul. Don't worry about it. I've worked here for years and never once saw Mr. Davenport mistreat or manhandle her." Hannah nodded in agreement, but Elena remained unconvinced. She opened her mouth to say more, but Jonathan, the head butler, appeared in the doorway. "That's enough gossiping," he said sternly. "Back to work, all of you. We need to have this place spotless before Mr. Davenport comes down." As Elena turned back to her tasks, her mind was racing. She knew now that something sinister was happening in the Davenport household, something that went far beyond a simple marital dispute. The barcode tattoo, Mrs. Davenport's fear, Mr. Davenport's controlling behavior. It all pointed to a dark secret that she was now unwittingly a part of. She glanced at the clock, wondering how she could help Mrs. Davenport without putting either of them in danger. As she scrubbed the kitchen counters, Elena made a silent vow to herself. She would find a way to help Mrs. Davenport, no matter the cost. The day progressed in an eerie calm, as if the earlier events had been nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. Elena went about her duties mechanically, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Mrs. Davenport and the mysterious barcode tattoo. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself in the living room, dusting the ornate shelves filled with leather-bound books and expensive trinkets. The sound of footsteps caught her attention, and she turned to see Mr. Davenport entering the living room. His wife was noticeably absent. His face was a mask of controlled tension. "Everyone," he called out, his voice carrying through the spacious villa. "Gather here immediately." Elena set down her duster and straightened her uniform as the other staff members began to file into the room. Hannah appeared at her side, shooting her a questioning glance. Marco, the chef, wiped his hands on his apron as he entered, followed by Jonathan, the butler, his usual stoic expression tinged with curiosity. As the staff assembled, forming a semicircle around Mr. Davenport, an uneasy silence fell over the room. Mr. Davenport's eyes scanned the gathered staff, his gaze sharp and scrutinizing. "I have an important announcement," he began, his voice low and controlled. "Mrs. Davenport is currently unwell and resting in our bedroom. Under no circumstances is anyone to enter her room or disturb her. Is that clear?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," echoed through the room. Elena felt her heart race, knowing the truth behind Mrs. Davenport's illness. She struggled to keep her face neutral, acutely aware of Mr. Davenport's piercing gaze as it swept over each staff member. Mr. Davenport continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Anyone found disobeying will face immediate dismissal, no exceptions." The staff exchanged nervous glances, the severity of Mr. Davenport's words hanging heavily in the air. "I will be leaving shortly on urgent business," Mr. Davenport added, adjusting his expensive watch. "I expect everything to be in perfect order upon my return. Jonathan, as head butler, you're in charge in my absence." Jonathan nodded solemnly. "Of course, sir, you can count on us." With one final sweeping look at his assembled staff, Mr. Davenport turned on his heel and strode out of the house. The sound of his footsteps faded, followed by the distant roar of his Ferrari's engine outside. Elena watched as he drove away. As the staff began to disperse, returning to their duties, Elena remained rooted to the spot. Her mind raced with the implications of Mr. Davenport's orders and the secret she now carried. Hannah approached her, concern etched on her face. "Elena, are you all right? You look pale." Elena forced a smile, trying to appear normal. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. It's been a long day." Hannah didn't seem entirely convinced, but nodded. "Well, we'd better get back to work. You know how Mr. Davenport is about everything being perfect." As Hannah walked away, Elena's gaze drifted toward the staircase leading to the upper floor. She thought of Mrs. Davenport. Alone, possibly hurt, trapped in a room she wasn't allowed to leave. The weight of her promise to keep the secret warred with her desire to help. Elena returned to her dusting, her movements now slow and distracted. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked away, each second feeling like an eternity. She knew she had to do something, but what? How could she help Mrs. Davenport without risking both their safety? As she moved through the living room, carefully cleaning each surface, Elena's mind worked furiously, trying to formulate a plan. Then she made a decision. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. With careful movements, she finished her cleaning duties and made her way to Jonathan. "Jonathan?" she said, keeping her voice steady. "I was thinking of cleaning the empty guest rooms upstairs. Open the windows to air them out, replace the flowers. Would that be all right?" Jonathan considered her request for a moment before nodding approvingly. "Good thinking, Elena. Here, take this bucket of fresh flowers with you. They were delivered this morning by our daily florist." He handed her a beautifully arranged assortment of blooms. With the bucket in hand, Elena ascended the grand staircase, her heart pounding with each step. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps, but to her, they seemed thunderously loud. As she reached the top, she paused, listening intently for any sound of movement. Elena's eyes were drawn to the closed door of the master bedroom. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Elena approached the door. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, remembering Mr. Davenport's stern warning. The consequences of disobedience hung heavily in the air, but the memory of Mrs. Davenport's fearful eyes and the mysterious barcode tattoo steeled Elena's resolve. She knocked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Davenport? It's me, Elena. Please, can you open the door?" For what seemed like an eternity, there was only silence. Elena's pulse raced, every second stretching out painfully. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a faint click. The door opened a crack, revealing Mrs. Davenport's pale, tear-stained face. "Elena!" Mrs. Davenport's voice was hoarse, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. "You shouldn't be here if anyone finds out." "I know," Elena replied, her voice low and urgent, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you. Are you all right?" Mrs. Davenport paused for a moment before opening the door wider, letting Elena slip inside. She clutched the bucket of flowers, afraid that leaving it outside in the hallway would draw attention and lead someone to search for her. Once the door clicked shut behind them, Elena set the bucket down beside the door. But as she took in the scene of Mrs. Davenport's room, she gasped at the sight before her. The usually immaculate room was in disarray. Shattered glass littered the floor near the vanity, and Elena could see visible bruises on Mrs. Davenport's arms and legs. The woman's designer dress was torn and stained with tears. "Oh my God," Elena breathed, setting down the flower bucket by the door. "What happened? Did Mr. Davenport do this to you?" Mrs. Davenport nodded weakly, tears welling up in her eyes. She took a step forward, but her legs gave out. Elena rushed to catch her, helping her to the edge of the luxurious king-size bed. "Please," Elena pleaded, her heart racing. "You have to tell me what's going on. What's the tattoo about? I want to help you. To get you out of this horror." Mrs. Davenport looked at Elena, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. I'm not willingly with him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He bought me. I belong to him now." Elena felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her. The opulent room seemed to spin around her as she struggled to comprehend Mrs. Davenport's words. "Bought?" Elena whispered in disbelief. "What do you mean? Did he take your money?" Mrs. Davenport shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "No, he bought me from—" But before she could finish her sentence, the distant roar of a Ferrari engine cut through the air. Mr. Davenport had returned, unexpectedly early. Panic flashed across Mrs. Davenport's face. "You have to go now," she hissed, her voice filled with terror. Elena stood, her mind racing. "I'll call for help," she said, moving towards the door. No, Mrs. Davenport pleaded, grabbing Elena's arm with surprising strength. "You can't do that. Please. It's not safe." But Elena's decision was made. With a final, reassuring glance at Mrs. Davenport, she slipped out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Elena rushed into one of the empty guest rooms, closing the door behind her as quietly as possible. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 91111. As the dispatcher answered, Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "Please, I need help," she said, her voice trembling. "I think there's a trafficking situation at the Davenport Villa. The address is—" She quickly gave the address and hung up, knowing that help was on the way. As she exited the room, she heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Mr. Davenport had returned, and he was heading straight for his wife's room. Elena rushed downstairs as soon as she heard the man enter the master bedroom, doing her best to appear calm and composed. She made her way to the kitchen, where Hannah was preparing tea. "Sister," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm done here." Hannah looked at her, confusion on her face. What do you mean? Have you finished all your jobs?" Before Elena could explain, a thunderous voice echoed through the house. "Everyone gather in the living room, now!" Elena and Hannah exchanged worried glances before making their way to the living room. The other staff members were already there, looking nervous and confused. Mr. Davenport stood in the center of the room, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Who is in my wife's room?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "I found this bucket of flowers there." Elena's heart sank as she realized she had forgotten the flower bucket in her haste to leave Mrs. Davenport's room. She felt Hannah's eyes on her, along with Jonathan's suspicious gaze. Mr. Davenport's eyes swept across the room, finally locking onto Elena as he noticed a few staff members glancing in her direction. "You," he said, pointing at her. You were the one tasked with the flowers, weren't you?" Elena opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room seemed to spin around her as she realized the gravity of her situation. As Elena reluctantly approached Mr. Davenport, her heart pounding in her chest, the air in the room suddenly filled with the distant wail of police sirens. The sound grew louder with each passing second, piercing the tense silence that had fallen over the gathered staff. Mr. Davenport's face drained of color, his eyes widening in panic. "You called the police?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of fear and rage. His gaze settled on Elena, who stood frozen before him. "You!" he spat, jabbing an accusing finger at her. "It must have been you!" His words were laced with venom, causing Elena to flinch involuntarily. The other staff members gasped, their shocked expressions a mixture of disbelief and confusion. The once orderly gathering had descended into chaos, with whispers and nervous glances exchanged between the employees. Mr. Davenport's composure crumbled entirely. Without another word, he bolted toward the front door, his expensive shoes echoing on the marble floor. The staff watched in stunned silence as their employer, usually so composed and authoritative, fled like a cornered animal. The roar of the Ferrari's engine cut through the air as Mr. Davenport attempted his escape. But his hope was short-lived. As he revved the engine, ready to speed away, police cars came into view, their flashing lights illuminating the long driveway. Realizing he was trapped, Mr. Davenport abandoned his vehicle and sprinted back into the house, his face a mask of desperation. He raced up the grand staircase, taking the steps two at a time. The staff, still reeling from the sudden turn of events, scattered as police officers stormed into the villa. Their authoritative voices filled the air, demanding everyone to back away and make room. In the midst of the chaos, Elena found her voice. "He went upstairs," she called out to the nearest officer, pointing toward the staircase to his wife's room. Without hesitation, several officers rushed up the stairs. Elena, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain, followed behind them. She kept a safe distance, her heart racing as she climbed the stairs she had traversed countless times before, but never under circumstances like these. As she reached the top of the staircase, Elena hung back, watching the scene unfold before her. The officers had cornered Mr. Davenport in front of the master bedroom door. The man she had once admired, the wealthy and powerful Richard Davenport, now looked small and pathetic. He pounded on the locked door. "Sophia!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Open the door! You have to tell them this is all a misunderstanding!" Elena watched in horror as Mr. Davenport grabbed a decorative chair from the hallway, lifting it above his head with the clear intention of breaking down the door. His face was contorted with rage and fear, a far cry from the composed businessman she had known. "Step away from the door, Mr. Davenport," one of the officers commanded, his hand on his holstered weapon. "Put down the chair and place your hands behind your back." For a moment, it seemed as though Mr. Davenport might actually attempt to fight his way out. His knuckles were white as he gripped the chair, his eyes wild and unfocused. But then, as if all the fight had suddenly left him, he lowered the chair to the ground. As the officers moved in to handcuff Mr. Davenport, Elena heard a soft click. The bedroom door opened slowly, revealing Mrs. Davenport. Sophia stood there, her face pale and tear-stained, but her eyes filled with newfound strength. "Officers," Mrs. Davenport whispered, her voice barely audible, "I have something to show you." With trembling hands, she turned around, revealing the bruises on her arms and legs, explaining that her husband had beaten her with a belt. Just as the officers were left in shock, she pulled down the collar of her dress, exposing the barcode tattoo that had been hidden for so long. The hallway fell silent as the implications of that simple gesture became clear. In that moment, as Elena watched from her position on the stairs, she knew that the life she had known, the world of the Davenport villa, had changed forever. The truth was finally coming to light, and there would be no going back. As the officers restrained Richard Davenport and began to move him, Elena quietly stepped back from the staircase, her heart racing in her chest. As she reached the door, she slipped out, joining the rest of the staff, who were anxiously gathered near the front of the house, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The distant murmur of voices grew louder as the police began escorting Mr. and Mrs. Davenport downstairs. Elena could hear his voice before she even saw him, his words sharp and frantic, filled with panic. "I'm sorry for everything. This is all a misunderstanding," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "The barcode is just a tattoo. It doesn't mean anything. You have to believe me. This is all wrong. I love my wife. I can prove it." The sight of Mr. Davenport struggling against the officers, still pleading with an unsettling desperation, made Elena's stomach turn. She watched, her eyes narrowing in disgust, as he continued to shout his apologies and denials, his voice rising in a frenzy, all while the police tried to keep him under control. His words seemed like empty excuses, nothing more than a desperate attempt to claw his way out of the consequences he'd brought upon himself. Then suddenly, Elena's heart lurched as Mr. Davenport spotted her. His wild, frantic eyes locked onto hers, and in that instant, he broke free from the officer's hold. Handcuffed and stumbling, Mr. Davenport threw himself forward, the sheer force of his anger propelling him despite the restraints. The officers reacted swiftly. One of them pulled out a taser and fired. A jolt of electricity coursed through Mr. Davenport's body, and he crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud. Elena flinched but couldn't tear her eyes away. She watched as Mr. Davenport struggled, his body twitching in the aftermath of the taser strike. The officers moved in quickly, restraining him once again and hauling him to his feet. With little fanfare, they shoved him into the back of the patrol car. The door slammed shut behind him with a final echoing sound. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, and Elena couldn't shake the cold shiver running down her spine. The grand villa, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, now buzzed with the movement of police and paramedics. Then she spotted Mrs. Davenport being gently guided by a team of paramedics toward a waiting ambulance. Without hesitation, Elena approached them. "Sophia," Elena called softly, her voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Davenport turned at the sound of Elena's voice. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else. Hope, perhaps. The paramedics were helping her onto a stretcher near the ambulance and began to examine her injuries right there in the driveway. Elena stood nearby, watching as the medical professionals tended to Mrs. Davenport's bruises and cuts. The police cars and ambulance cast an eerie glow over the manicured lawns and the elegant facade of the villa. "Sophia," Elena said again, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. Is there anything I can do?" Mrs. Davenport managed a weak smile. "You're already doing it," she replied. "Just stay with me. I don't want to be alone right now." Elena nodded. A female police officer approached them. "Mrs. Davenport," she began, "I'm Officer Martinez. I know this is difficult, but we need to take your statement while the events are still fresh in your mind. Are you feeling up to answering some questions?" Mrs. Davenport took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to her neck where the barcode tattoo lay hidden. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's time I told the whole story." Officer Martinez nodded sympathetically and pulled out a notepad. "Can you start by telling me your full name?" Mrs. Davenport hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "My name is Sophia Lauren she said slowly, "but my birth name is Melia Sinclair." Elena was taken aback by the revelation of her real name. The officer's pen stilled. His face was unreadable as he repeated her name quietly, almost as if running it through an internal system. Moments later, he glanced down at his tablet, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen, cross-referencing her name with records. A brief pause followed before his eyes widened in surprise, a flash of shock crossing his face. He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with newfound intensity. "Melia Sinclair," he repeated, his voice now softer, almost reverent. "You were reported missing 10 years ago from an orphanage. If I'm reading this right, you were 16 years old at the time." Elena held her breath, the weight of his words sinking in. She could feel Mrs. Davenport, Melia, tense beside her, as if the truth of her past had just resurfaced like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Mrs. Davenport nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "That's right," she confirmed. That's where it all began." The officer continued, explaining how her disappearance had been a high-profile case, one that had never been solved. Elena saw the flash of recognition in his eyes, as though he'd pieced something together in that moment. Over the next hour, as the paramedics continued treating her injuries, Mrs. Davenport recounted her harrowing story. She spoke of being lured away from the orphanage with promises of a modeling career, only to find herself trapped in a sophisticated trafficking ring. Her voice trembled as she described the years of forced labor, disguised as high-end fashion modeling for exclusive designers. "They branded us," she said, her hand moving to her neck. "Each barcode is unique. It's how they track us. Trade us." Elena felt sick to her stomach as she listened. She reached out and took Mrs. Davenport's hand, offering what little comfort she could. "5 years ago," she continued, her voice growing stronger, I was sold to Richard Davenport." She paused, swallowing hard. "At first I thought I had finally escaped the worst of it. He was kind, gentle even. He gave me a new name, a new identity. For a while I believed I was living a fairy tale." Her expression darkened, but it was just another cage. A gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. He became possessive, controlling. I wasn't allowed to leave the house without him or his security team. If I disobeyed, she trailed off, her gaze distant. Officer Martinez listened intently, taking detailed notes. "Mrs. Davenport," she said gently, "why didn't you try to escape or report this while you were in the trafficking ring?" Mrs. Davenport's eyes filled with tears. "I did, at first," she admitted, "but they always found us, and the punishment," she shuddered. "After a while, I convinced myself this was my life now. I had no skills, no education beyond what they taught us for our modeling careers. Where would I go? What would I do? At least in the ring I had food, shelter, designer clothes. It was better than ending up on the streets or in even worse situations." As she spoke, Hannah approached cautiously, her face a mask of confusion and concern. Elena gestured for her to join them, knowing that Hannah deserved to understand what was happening, since she had been the one to introduce her to this job in the first place. "And the tattoo?" Officer Martinez prompted gently. "Why did Mr. Davenport insist on you keeping it?" Mrs. Davenport's face flushed with shame. He said it excited him," she whispered. "It made him feel powerful, knowing he had bought me, that I belonged to him." The gravity of her words hung heavily in the air. The distant sounds of neighbors gathering and the occasional wail of a police siren were the only noises that broke the stunned silence. Officer Martinez cleared her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your testimony is incredibly valuable. With your help, we may be able to bring down this entire trafficking network." Mrs. Davenport nodded slowly. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the stretcher, as if bracing herself for what was to come. She had been through so much already, but this felt different. This was the moment when the past might finally come crashing down, and something new could be built from the ashes. "Before we proceed," Sophia spoke up, her voice low but clear. "There's something else." She paused, her eyes flickering toward Elena. "I'd like to be addressed as Sophia, not Mrs. Davenport." Her voice wavered slightly, but she held herself with quiet strength. "I don't want to be called Melia either. That name, it reminds me of a person I no longer want to be." The officers exchanged glances, but Sophia's tone left no room for argument. "I was saved by Elena under the name Sophia, and that's who I am now." A reminder that Sophia survived. She made it out alive. The officers nodded solemnly, respecting her wishes. The air felt heavier for a moment, and Elena could see the flicker of something in Sophia's eyes, both pain and determination. This name, this identity was more than just a title. It was a symbol of her strength, of the life she had clawed her way back to against all odds. "So what happens now?" Sophia asked, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "We need to ask you more questions," Officer Martinez explained, "and we'll have to take photographs of your tattoo as evidence. But for now, you're safe. We'll arrange for a safe house and protective custody until we can ensure your security." As Officer Martinez stepped away to make the necessary arrangements, Sophia turned to Elena and Hannah. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Especially you, Elena. You saw through everything. You didn't give up on me." Elena squeezed Sophia's hand. "You don't need to thank me," she said firmly. "I'm just glad you're safe now. And I meant what I said earlier. We'll get through this together." Hannah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "I can't believe we never noticed," she said, her voice filled with regret. "All this time we thought you had such a perfect life." Sophia gave her a sad smile. "That's what Richard wanted everyone to think. It's what I tried to believe myself for a long time." As they sat there, three women brought together by extraordinary circumstances, Elena realized that their journey was far from over. As Elena, Hannah, and Sophia prepared to leave for the police station, they were guided toward a waiting police car. The day had progressed, and the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles cast an otherworldly glow across the dimming horizon. As they walked, they passed by the other staff members, who were still being interviewed in the yard. Marco and Jonathan stood together, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. The other maids and household staff wore similar expressions, all of them looking lost and bewildered in the chaos that had descended upon their workplace. Elena caught Marco's eye as they passed. The chef, who had always seemed so confident and in control, now looked small and uncertain. Jonathan, usually stoic and composed, appeared shaken, his usual air of authority completely dissipated. Hannah, seeing their confused expressions, called out to them. "I'll explain everything later," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "But for now, you might want to start looking for new jobs." The reality of the situation seemed to hit Marco and Jonathan at that moment. They exchanged worried glances, the gravity of the day's events finally sinking in. Their comfortable positions in the household of a respected millionaire had evaporated in a matter of hours. As they reached the police car, an officer opened the back door for them. Sophia entered first, followed by Elena, and then Hannah. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing them in the quiet interior of the vehicle. As the car pulled away from the Davenport villa, Elena found herself staring out the window, watching as the grand house grew smaller in the distance. The officer in the front seat eyed them curiously in the rearview mirror, but remained silent, allowing the women a moment of quiet reflection. Elena's mind whirled with the events of the day. It seemed impossible that just this morning she had been nothing more than a newly hired maid in awe of her wealthy employers and the luxurious world they inhabited. She thought back to her first days at the villa, how excited she had been to work for the famous Richard Davenport. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been a trainee, eagerly soaking up every detail about the household and its routines. She remembered how she had admired Mr. Davenport from afar, seeing him as a source of inspiration and success. This job had been a dream come true for her, a chance to serve someone she believed to be great. Now, as the police car wound its way through the quiet streets, Elena marveled at how much had changed in a single day. She was no longer just a maid. She had become the person who had uncovered a dark secret, who had taken action to help someone in need. In doing so, she had dismantled the carefully constructed facade of the Davenport household, ruining the reputation and success of the man she had once admired. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. The very person she had longed to serve and impress was now revealed to be a criminal, his success built on the suffering of others. She had traded her dream job for something far more important, the truth, and the chance to help Sophia find freedom. As Elena glanced at Sophia, who sat quietly between her and Hannah, she knew that despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she had made the right choice. The road before them would be challenging, filled with police statements, potential trials, and the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. But as Elena sat in the back of that police car, flanked by her sister and the woman she had helped save, she felt a glimmer of hope. The Davenport villa, with all its luxury and secrets, was now behind them. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but one filled with the promise of justice and the strength of the unexpected bond forged between the three women. Whatever challenges they would face, Elena knew they would face them together.